Welcome to Chapter 3, Episode 4, New World and Worlds. In our previous episode, The Venetian Connection, we spent some time on the history and development of the printing press and how it revolutionized communications in Europe at the time, and how it affected musical culture, dissemination, and notation. We were introduced to the Franco-Flemish composer par excellence, Josquin de Prez, and took a deep dive into his superlative motet, Ave Maria Virgo Serena. In this episode, we will see how, towards the end of the 15th century, the medieval world definitively came tumbling down. After the fall of Byzantium in 1453, developments at the end of the century disrupted the knowledge and wisdom of the Middle Ages. The exploration of the New World by Columbus in 1492 opened a new chapter in an understanding of geography and brought in its wake trade, wealth, and colonization. At the same time, the work of Copernicus, leading into the 16th century, was beginning to throw into question the Earth-centric cosmos as imagined by Ptolemy and Aristotle. A new era of discovery and disorientation was on the horizon in the 16th century.
Over the past 3 episodes, we've looked at how an accelerating exchange of ideas shaped the Renaissance through the forces of Renaissance humanism, of trade and diplomacy, and of the communications revolution of the printing press. We've connected these dots through the story of Venice and how a Venetian network throughout the Mediterranean facilitated connections with North Africa, Egypt, the Levant, the Byzantine Empire, and the growing Ottoman Empire. In this episode, we're looking at how that enclosed Mediterranean world, over the course of the 15th century, opened up to new worlds, and what role a small agrarian kingdom at the far south and west of Europe played in that transformation. In 1390, King John I, acceded to the throne in Portugal, defended his position against Spanish attacks, and mostly focused on peacefully developing the economy of the territory perched on the Iberian Peninsula facing the Atlantic. But in 1415, King John I captured the Moorish port of Ceuta on the northern shore of Morocco. The move was meant to thwart attacks of the Barbary pirates and to control navigation of the northern coast of Africa. But in fact, it opened the doors to the Atlantic and a much wider berth of exploration. Involved in this capture of Ceuta was John's son, now known to the world as Prince Henry the Navigator. After this victory, Prince Henry began to systematically explore the western coast of Africa. His hope was to find the source of the West African gold trade, as well as to eliminate pirate attacks on Portugal. Under Henry's direction, by mid-century, a new ship was designed, much lighter and more agile than Mediterranean cargo ships. The light, square-rigged caravel was more maneuverable, could sail into the wind, and enabled Portuguese sailors to freely explore, from rivers and shallows to transatlantic voyages. It's worth remembering that, when Henry began these voyages, the map of the world derived from the classical authority of the 2nd century mathematician, geographer, and astronomer, Ptolemy. Ptolemy's writings on astronomy had shaped the map of the cosmos with the Earth at a center of concentric circles, and that conception of the cosmos remained the accepted model. And Ptolemy's work on geography depicted the known world in Roman times, from Portugal to China, and the enclosed seas of the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, as seen in this 15th century map derived from Ptolemy's writings. From 1415 onwards, Prince Henry's voyages began to push against the boundaries of that known world. In 1419, Henry's sailors were driven by storm to Madeira, and in 1427 they reached the Azores, which lie 745 miles from the Portuguese coast. By 1434, Henry's sailors crossed Cape Bojador on the African coast, which had previously been feared by superstitious European sailors as the edge of the world. Over the course of the remaining decades of Henry's life, these explorations further explored and mapped the west coast of Africa, as far south as Cape Verde. In addition to the detailed mapping and the innovation of the caravel, these voyages served as a laboratory for developing navigational skills, data, and instruments, and is one of the earliest examples of systematic scientific inquiry sustained over decades. It's interesting to note that, even earlier than the Portuguese explorations, the great Chinese Ming Dynasty captain Zheng He began eastward explorations of the Indian Ocean, reaching far south down the eastern coast of Africa. Zheng He's first voyage in 1405 included 317 ships with 28,000 crewmen. The largest ships were known as treasure ships and were 417 feet long with 9 masts, compared to the 75 feet and 4 masts of the Portuguese caravels. It is thought that his 5th and 6th voyages between 1417 and 1422 reached as far south as Madagascar. And after the 7th and final voyage, Zheng He is thought to have died in Calicut, the Indian epicenter of the spice trade, in 1433. Henry the Navigator's exploration of the west coast of Africa and the development of the caravel set the stage for enthusiastic Portuguese expeditions in the 1480s, seeking a route to India to capitalize on the spice trade. In 1488, Bartholomew Diaz reached the Cape of Good Hope, and by 1498, Vasco da Gama reached Calicut. These Portuguese voyages opened up a sea route between Europe and Asia, and of course brought wealth and power, and they spurred other European nations to compete, quite notably with Christopher Columbus's voyages for the Castilian throne in 1492. This explosion of exploration over the next century also brought about a dark side of the Renaissance: the rise of European colonialism and its legacy of violence, exploitation, slavery, and empire. These consequences are an important fact of the history that must be acknowledged, with repercussions that continue to shape our world to this day. One other important consequence of the voyages was the transformation of the idea of Europe's place in the world. Rather than the enclosed cosmos of the Mediterranean, the voyages opened up the reality of vast new oceans, unknown cultures, and brave new worlds. This Portuguese map from 1502, the same year that Josquin's masses were printed by Petrucci in Venice, shows that the Ptolemaic map of the world and its classical authority no longer adequately described reality. By 1502, in this period of humanism, the printing press, and exploration of the globe, the young Polish mathematician Copernicus had started his interest in astronomy at universities in Bologna and Padua. These early studies of the moon and the stars would ultimately lead to the challenge of Ptolemy's map of the heavens as well. But we'll leave that as another story for another day.
The discovery of the New World, or New Worlds, the Age of Exploration, which of course is inaugurated already in the 15th century as various Portuguese and other voyagers go out across exploring West Africa, and eventually, of course, Columbus, and then we get to the early 16th century, Magellan's disastrous circumnavigation of the globe. And of course, we all know the cultural price that many paid through these encounters, which were not just discoveries, but which were conquests, which were indoctrinations, inculturations, and spread of conquest in the service of king and church wherever Europeans went. And this is an important thing that we can't omit or we can't ignore. But there was a tremendous musical interchange that came along with this. As we think about recognition of sounds and experiences in other places, we have testimony by those who fanned out, again, in these agents of conquest and conversion. The way that they heard local sounds, they certainly recognized music making among indigenous peoples in New Spain, whether they were native folk in North America or in Africa, that cultures that they would encounter, or as they went to the court in China, in Beijing, in the late 16th century, Jesuits fanning out to Japan and others. Each of these encountered other cultures, said things about the music that they heard, and used these as markers and reflections of their own ideas of civility and spirituality. In other ways, there was also some really remarkable interchange. There are episodes we know about as the Jesuits went into Beijing, where they carried with them really the latest of musical technology. It's one of the curiosities of the 16th century that musical instruments were a kind of high tech as far as European construction was concerned. And it's very interesting that when the Jesuits show up in Beijing, what they bring with them in the diplomatic kit bag are things like clocks and clavichords. And these were things very typical. We know this into the 17th century as well. We know in the 16th century there was an embassy of the French and English, and there's Edward Dallam is the English visitor, who's basically an organ maker who sails all the way to Constantinople, to Istanbul, with a wooden organ, mechanical organ. It's a mechanical instrument that's wound up and played to bring this as a present to the Sultan in Istanbul. And a tremendous amount of cultural energy and worry went into this now kind of automatic music-making machine that was to be brought as a gift. And so there is a sense of interchange. There's certainly a great deal of injustice that comes through music, and a great deal of racism and prejudice that is foisted, that's used to subjugate peoples. But there's also moments in which, how do we want to put it, we catch the Renaissance listening to itself, or at least listening to others in a way that might help them reflect upon themselves.
Let's continue our exploration of the music of Josquin de Prez, this time looking at one of his most beautiful chansons, Mille Regrets. Mille Regrets draws from a chanson tradition of serious poetry that was popular in French-speaking courts of the late 15th century to the early 16th century. Many music books of the day included pieces on the regret theme by various composers. Josquin de Prez also took part in this tradition. The text, like many regret poems, focuses on the woes of lost love to the point of real physical suffering, which is felt and expressed more urgently by the singing voice.
What he does in Mille Regrets, which actually may or may not be by Josquin, we're not quite sure. The source tradition is actually rather complex, and it's a late piece, but it does fit with some of his, many of his techniques. And then in the Arcadelt, Il Bianco e Dolce Cigno, the madrigal from the 1530s, in each of these we have a speaking persona and an intelligible presentation of a text. It's interesting that in Mille Regrets, it's someone doing the talking, an individual. In Il Bianco e Dolce Cigno, it also is an individual. The swan dies singing, I die too. Right, so there's this idea of an individual, and we talked about that notion of subjectivity and individuality that are there. And so I think we can hear those emerging in the musical surface. This is not to suggest that Dufay or Ockeghem or Busnoys did not think of themselves as individuals. It's just the extent to which that sensibility is manifest in the musical surface of the language and the way it intersects with things.
Dr. Friedman teaches us that each line of the chanson is joined with a distinctive melodic phrase. This chanson is unusual in that it avoids solid cadences to a considerable extent. Many of the customary forms of motion are avoided, ending poetic lines with a great deal of dissatisfaction, unresolved tension. This ambiguity is a characteristic of works centering around the tone E. Cadences to E, Phrygian cadences that is, because in the Phrygian mode, the second tone of the scale, F, is just a half step above the final, or what we hear as the tonic. You can hear the extra doleful quality when singing the span of a third in Phrygian mode versus the normal minor scale, which begins with a full whole step. Do, re, mi, re, do. Do, ra, mi, ra, do. Phrygian cadences, Dr. Friedman tells us, quote, were often used by 15th and 16th century composers as markers of emotional distress, longing, or unfinished business, end quote. Let's listen to Mille Regrets by Josquin, noting the doleful quality of unresolved musical tension characterized by the Phrygian cadence. I think Mille Regrets is a vivid example of how composers construct feeling in music, in this case, even physical pain of lost love. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Next, we turn to an Italian madrigal by the Franco-Flemish composer Jacques Arcadelt. Arcadelt was active in both France and Italy, even becoming a member of the papal choir in Rome, and then in the Sistine Chapel choir. He wrote sacred music, but was famous in his lifetime for establishing, along with Philippe Verdelot, the madrigal. His works were widely published and considered pristine or classic exemplars of the madrigal. Il Bianco e Dolce Cigno was the most popular madrigal of the 16th century, remaining in print for more than 100 years. It is an early example expressing la petite mort, the little death. Those of you who know poetry from the era know that the little death is a euphemism for post-coital bliss, the transcendent loss of consciousness after expending one's life force. Indeed, Dr. Friedman writes in his anthology To Music in the Renaissance, quote, "The text is poised at the intersection of two deaths, the disconsolate death of the swan and the blissful one that the speaker is willing to endure 1,000 times a day," end quote. The poem is short enough, let me read it for you. "The white and gentle swan dies singing, and I, weeping, approach the end of my life. Strange and different fate that he dies disconsolate and I die happy. Death that in dying fills me with complete joy and desire. If in dying I feel no other sorrow, 1,000 deaths a day would content me." Dr. Friedman explains that, quote, "The most remarkable thing about Il Bianco e Dolce Cigno, however, is the way Arcadelt breaks up poetic lines in order to exaggerate and then conflate his two singing subjects. In measures 4 through 5, he brings the upper three voices to a clear cadence at cantando more, right in the middle of a poetic line. The gesture allows him to enjam the remainder of that line of verse with the words of the next verse, et io piangendo giung al fin del viver mio," end quote. Dr. Friedman continues, quote, Arcadelt quite literally enacts the 1,000 hoped-for deaths in a seemingly endless cascade of imitative entries among the four voices. It is a beautiful conclusion to the work and fits the sense of the text perfectly. End quote. Let's listen to Il Bianco e Dolcecino, paying special attention to how Arcadelt gives new or exaggerated meaning to the text by interrupting poetic syntax with a different musical one, and how the gestures near the very end imitate a cascade of little deaths.
Il bianco e dolce cigno cantando muore ed io piangendo giuro al fin del viverio ed io piangendo giuro al fin del viverio strane diversas moses consonato ed io morte che nel morire nel piedi gioia tutto e di desire se nel morir al trono non sento di mille morti
This madrigal is a perfect example of how music can exaggerate and amplify the meaning of a poem in ways that might escape us when simply looking at the printed page or even reciting it. And we saw in a secular chanson and madrigal by Josquin de Prez and Jacques Arcadelt how longing, even pain, and la petite mort, the little death, are brought closer to physical sensation through singing. We hope you have enjoyed this episode. We are eager to read your comments, so please contribute some of your stories of similar poetry that moved you. You can also contribute by liking this episode, subscribing to our channel, and by sharing with our friends on Facebook. Grazie mille. In our next chapter, we will discover the music of 16th century England, replete with the crises of belief brought on by the Protestant Reformation, how England became a world power, the incredible flowering of Elizabethan theater, and how tradition and innovation intermingled, bringing us to the closing acts of the Renaissance. Please join us.